Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. Today on the show, Scoot Henderson as a potential trade target for the Wolves. If they trade Karl-Anthony Towns to the Portland Trail Blazers to land pick number 3, could the Wolves or should the Wolves consider Scoot Henderson as a possible fit for the future next to Anthony Edwards in the Wolves backcourt? We're going to break it all down on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And a big thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen every day. This show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find Locked on Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, not just Locked on Wolves, but all the other Minnesota podcasts at Locked On, available on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app that you can download for both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. Download Locked On Sports Minnesota, the app, today. Again, that's Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And of course, you can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken, and that's with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right, I want to spend the show today talking about Scoot Henderson. No, the Timberwolves do not have a first-round pick in this year's draft. And if you missed Thursday's show, I spent the entire show, really, well, 2/3 of the show, talking about the Timberwolves' future draft pick situation, kind of recapping what the Wolves owe and what they are owed by other teams. But, of course, this season, they traded both their first and second-round picks, or I should say this summer in June's draft. They do have the Knicks' second-round pick, so number 53. No first-round picks to be had for Minnesota, and they do have one in 24, by the way. But this year, in a loaded draft, when you could make the argument that the players most often mocked at 1, 2, and 3, most years would probably all qualify as the number 1 pick. So had a little bit of a conversation, I think it was early last week, maybe even the week before, after the draft lottery, about Portland being at number 3 when the lottery was all said and done. Of course, Portland's looking for another star to pair with Damian Lillard and doesn't want to move Dame. They want to continue to try and be competitive with him. And that would, I guess, naturally makes the Timberwolves a potential trade partner if they indeed trade Karl-Anthony Towns. And I've spent a ton of time over the past couple of weeks talking about this, so I'm not going to rehash all the reasoning behind, but the cliff notes are: next year, Towns' contract goes up to $50 million. The Supermax kicks in. Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels are both owed extensions. And, of course, Rudy Gobert already makes over $40 million a year, 3 more years on that deal. You have to figure out a point guard situation. They have a first-round pick next year, but beyond that, not very many picks. So there isn't a whole lot of flexibility in the Wolves cap situation. And if you want to get ahead of Towns' contract going up to the Supermax, now might be the right time to trade him, because otherwise you run the risk of being in the luxury tax next year and the year after, and you can't pay the repeater tax if you're the Minnesota Timberwolves. So yes, there are some other ways to go about this, and I'm on record as saying on this show, I still think it's more likely than not that they do not trade Karl-Anthony Towns this summer. I do think he'll be, if I had to pick right now, if I had to place a bet, I would say Karl-Anthony Towns is on the Wolves roster on opening night this fall. However, it's a non-zero chance that the Timberwolves trade Karl-Anthony Towns. And I think the last percentage, if you will, I put on it was 75-25. He's still on the Wolves. But, I mean, even if there's a 25% chance they trade him, it's absolutely worth considering what the options are. And Portland jumps out as a real option at number 3 in a really deep draft. And Houston, to a lesser extent, at number 4, because I think, Portland with Dame at least can talk themselves into, like, hey, this makes sense to add Towns. Towns doesn't have to be the alpha, although he's much younger than Dame. Dame is still the alpha in that situation. In Houston, depending on what you think about some of their other young pieces, he makes a little bit less sense. And also, by the way, I think there's a clear, we can maybe talk about tiers in another episode, but I think there's a clear top 3 in this draft. So 3 to me is more valuable than 4. Well, it always is, but even more so this year. All that to say, Scoot Henderson is the player that almost certainly will be available at 3 and actually does kind of fit, not kind of, does fit positionally what the Wolves need, right? The Timberwolves have one more year of Mike Conley, almost certainly. He's got about $15 million guaranteed on a $23 million deal. He'll be back at that $23 million next year, but then he's expiring. He'll also be like 37 or whatever next summer. So it's pretty likely Mike Conley moves on after this year. The Timberwolves need a point guard moving forward, and they need some cost certainty. Yes, it's expensive to have the number 3 overall pick on your roster, but at least you know what you're paying him for the next 4 seasons. And you obviously then have quote unquote team control beyond that because nobody's going to turn down a max. I'll get to that a little bit because then salaries start to become an issue in a few years once again, even if you do trade Karl-Anthony Towns now, but you're at least kicking that can down the road a bit. So what I want to do today is dive into Scoot Henderson a little bit as a prospect and also as a potential fit on the Timberwolves roster. And I'm going to break this up. I'm going to make the case, basically his strengths and why I think he's a good fit. And then my concerns / weaknesses and why I'm concerned about the fit. And then I'll give kind of a something of a verdict at the end of the show, because as with any rookie or as with any draft prospect, I should say, really, there are concerns, right? But there's also the roster fit side of things and how do they fit with the roster? And usually when you're drafting at the top of the draft, fit doesn't matter. You're picking for sheer talent level versus roster fit or positional fit. And the reason being is because usually if you're drafted at the top of the draft, it's because you're a bad team and who cares? Like, you're trying to draft a franchise player. The Wolves in this situation would be in a very unique situation because they'd have Ant, who is just the number 1 overall pick, less than 4 years ago. That was that weird November 2020 draft, or I guess less than 3 years ago. And would also have Jaden McDaniels, who was a lottery talent they got late in the first round, and are building around Ant and Jaden McDaniels. So this would be a bit of a different situation. But Scoot Henderson is actually kind of the best of both worlds. There was many scouts who have said, many write-ups out there that you can find that say in a normal draft, quote unquote, normal draft without the top talent that's going to go at 1 and 2, Scoot Henderson would be a really nice number 1 overall pick. So let's get into a little bit of some of his strengths, some of his weaknesses, and where I land on the possibility of Scoot Henderson on the Wolves. So I want to start with a couple of key strengths that Scoot has. One is his size. And I know that he's only 6'2", and in today's NBA, that's a little on the smaller side for a guard, as crazy as that sounds. He has a 6'9" wingspan, and he's also really well built. Like he came into the G League as, I think, a 17-year-old, but the way he's built like Anthony Edwards. And I know Ant is like 6'6" now or whatever with a ridiculous like 7+ foot wingspan. But if you're 6'2" with a 6'9" wingspan, that will play at the NBA level at point guard. If you're as good with the ball in your hands, have as good of a handle, or as good of a passer as Scoot Henderson. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But the build of Scoot Henderson will allow him to take contact. It allows him to finish through contact. It allows him to use physicality on the defensive end of the floor. On the glass, he's a good rebounder as well. We'll talk about that too. But the size, to me, would play with the Wolves because you add to that his instincts, his athleticism, and the wingspan primarily. It's not so much the height as it is the wingspan. You don't worry as much about the height. Like, we'll talk about his jump shot. It's an issue. But that would be my only concern, is getting his shot off on the perimeter against bigger perimeter defenders. We'll talk about his mid-range game, his floaters, his ability to finish in traffic. All that stuff is fine at his current size. And he's been in the G League the last couple of years. And even if it isn't NBA overall, like NBA caliber teams, it's NBA caliber talent in terms of size and athleticism. Yes, the game's different. It's faster paced. It's sloppier. It's more disjointed. There's less well-run sets. All that stuff is true. But the size and athleticism of the defenders that he was facing is not all that different from the NBA level. I think the 6'2" height with the 6'9" wingspan plays, especially if you're playing next to Anthony Edwards, who's 6'6"-ish, 7'1"-ish wingspan, or whatever he's at now, 7'2" wingspan, whatever crazy size Anthony Edwards is up to at this point. You can play a guard of that size next to Anthony Edwards, and I don't think it's an issue. The athleticism is incredible. It's really, really impressive. And like I said, he has such a such a thick build, his frame, his shoulder, his torso, his arms, like everything about him screams like, hey, I can take contact, I can fight through contact, I can be physical on both ends of the floor. Combine that with being a well above average athlete. I mean, some of the dunk highlights from the G League are incredible. They just are, with the 6'9" wingspan. All of that works really, really, really well. The most impressive thing, though, about Scoot Henderson is what I want to get to next, and it would actually fit the Wolves and their current roster, even sans Karl-Anthony Towns, because in this deal, the only way you're getting Scoot Henderson is if you trade Karl-Anthony Towns. Without Towns, I actually think this next aspect of Scoot's game would fit the Timberwolves perfectly. So we'll do that next, and then we will close with some of my concerns and ultimately what I would do if I were the Timberwolves. And obviously without all the details, if this type of a deal were on the table. We'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, and now we are into the finals. Game 1 in the books. Right now, new customers at FanDuel can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Now, the finals, after Game 1, a lot of people are going to feel that it's going to go heavily one direction, but, I mean, obviously Miami's proven us wrong time and time again. The grit that Miami has, Jimmy Butler, Eric Spoelstra, Pat Riley, that whole team, I would be taking a hard look at Miami bets at least. Maybe it's not, I'm not saying they're going to win the series necessarily or even Game 2, but maybe if you look at like, hey, what is Nuggets in 6 look like or something like that, because I do think Miami's going to be competitive the rest of the series, or at least in a couple of games in the series. There's plenty of things to love about FanDuel. They do great promotions every single day. It's a safe and secure app. And of course, you can also get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 at FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so we talked about Scoot Henderson's size, his wingspan, his athleticism, his build. The most encouraging thing about Scoot Henderson, though, the most encouraging thing is that he's a genuinely great pick and roll guard, both as a passer, a facilitator, distributor, and as well as a finisher, as an attacker. We'll start first with his ability to attack. Teams simply cannot play drop coverage against him. And actually, let me say it this way. It doesn't matter what coverage a team plays against him. Scoot Henderson can thrive in pick and roll offensively. Teams can't play drop against him because he's a dynamic mid-range jump shooter, which is maybe a little bit of an oxymoron because, mid-range jump shots are kind of by definition not dynamic. But he has the ability, has shown the comfort level to be in kind of like that Kyrie Irving, D'Angelo Russell type of mold where pull up from, 16, 18 feet and feel like you're automatic. Now, the percentage wasn't amazing. It was a little more streaky than anything else, but the confidence level and his ability to make that shot is there. And yes, there's some concerns about shot selection, et cetera, but we're talking about a kid that went pro when he was 17. He can also knock down runners and floaters extremely well. So if you're backpedaling against him, he's comfortable to take what you give him. And if you try and firm up that defense at 10, 12 feet, he'll hit the runner over you. He'll hit the floater. The touch is just incredible. And combine that, by the way, I mentioned this earlier, but his ball handling ability, if you watch some of the cut-ups of him on YouTube, the ball control that he has, both his handle in the open floor, but also when he takes that exceedingly quick first step, either in isolation situations or against pick and roll defense, but against a set defense, regardless, the first step and then the ball control to know exactly what to do with it, whether it's to keep it low to avoid a swipe, to bring it high to avoid a swipe. It's just incredible, his ability to protect the basketball, which is something that, frankly, Anthony Edwards has actually not always been very good at. That's an instinct that I think Scoot Henderson has that I don't think Ant did when he came into the league, is ball protection and ball control when he's gathering to shoot, whether it's a floater, a runner, getting all the way into the paint, etc. If teams trap him, or if they blitz him on the perimeter, if they try and ice him on the sideline, he has such good vision that he can beat those traps extremely well. I would say if you watch cut-ups of him being blitzed in pick and roll, he's hitting that skip pass to the opposite corner like consistently. He just kills the blitzes and the traps because he knows exactly where the help is coming from. So as soon as he starts to turn that or tries to turn a corner, the low man starts to set up or step up, he can see straight across the opposite corner. We saw Ant get better at this year. He was slinging those left-handed, one-handed passes to the corner. Ant didn't do that his rookie season. He barely did it his second season. And Scoot Henderson's doing that now in the G League, and he did a little less of it more recently than it is first year. But I think that's just because teams are so much more aggressively guarding him. But the fact that he's got the basketball IQ, the court vision, the awareness to know that that guy's there in the opposite corner or to find the right. There's also some good examples of him where there's a cutter baseline that just kind of dives to the rim and he hits that cutter as well. So he knows where everybody else, all his other offensive teammates are on the floor. Not only does he have the vision, the awareness, the IQ to do it, he's got the ability to complete those passes. And that to me is the most exciting thing about Scoot Henderson because we saw D'Angelo Russell really struggle in pick and roll game as a Minnesota Timberwolf. And that was kind of one of the selling points was like, hey, D'Lo cat pick and roll is going to be unstoppable. That never really happened. And yes, there's a lot of other factors. That's a whole other podcast episode, the injuries, all that stuff. It just never really happened. And D'Lo and Rudy was much even further away from happening. And Mike Conley and Rudy Gobert have a really nice dynamic. And Mike Conley is a good shooter out of pick and roll. He's also got a really good floater, but he's also 36 years old and doesn't have that ability or willingness. I guess doesn't have the willingness because he doesn't have the ability to get all the way to the rim and add that dynamic piece to it. Scoot Henderson can't because of his size and his athleticism and his scoring touch at the rim. So opposing defenses have to respect the fact that Scoot Henderson can get past them, can shoot the floater or the runner. He can hit cutters. He can hit spot up shooters in the opposite corner with skip passes. The court vision and the feel in pick and roll game at his age is just incredible. Like, I don't know how else to say it. It already is a starter level NBA skill, the way he manages pick and roll game on offense. And that to me is the most tantalizing thing. The idea of putting Scoot Henderson in pick and roll, pick and pop with Rudy Gobert and Naz Reid. Obviously, you're not playing pick and pop with Rudy, but how dynamic that would be. And this year you could in small lineups play him with Mike Conley, and then you know. Also, by the way, I should mention Scoot Henderson is going to play point guard at the NBA level, but he has the ability as a cutter off the ball too. That's another example of his basketball IQ for a player that young to understand timing and spacing and cutting as well as he appears to is pretty incredible. So if Ant's running the show and Scoot's off the ball, that works. From a ball movement, a basketball IQ standpoint, I think Scoot Henderson could do that. Also, he's a solid rebounder for his size, especially. And I think that could continue to improve. Now, we said the same thing about Ant coming into the league. He was a poor rebounder his first 2 years. He improved pretty significantly this year. Anthony Edwards did on the glass. And I think there's that upside still to be had. Certainly. I mean, we're talking about a 19-year-old with Scoot Henderson. Like there's obviously tons of upside there, but the early returns on his rebound abilities compared to other guards, other point guards, is really impressive. And the 6'9" wingspan, the athleticism, and how hard he plays, all kind of play into that. I think he's got a nose for the ball. He wants to grab defensive rebounds and get back the other way. That's one of the things that excites me about him as well. But the pick and roll thing is number one. The fact that he can attack you downhill. You simply, like, you could go below screens against him because we'll talk about his shooting here in a minute. But you can't just continue to drop because he is happy to take the mid-range. And if you step up, he's going to dump it to somebody cutting baseline. He's going to swing it to the opposite corner for the spot up three, or he'll throw it back to the roller or the popper, the screener. And like, he's more than willing as a passer, highlight reel assists, the easy assists, whatever it is. Scoot Henderson can do all of those things. And it was just, it's phenomenal to watch what he did with the ball in his hands in the G League. And beyond this year of Mike Conley, the Wolves need somebody else. Like, yes, point Ant is fun. Point Ant can be a thing. And I'll talk about my concerns about taking the ball out of Ant's hands with a player like Scoot Henderson next segment. But the Wolves still need a point guard, and that is what Scoot Henderson is. He is so similar to Anthony Edwards' profile as a college player after 1 year at the University of Georgia. He's like a shorter version of Ant in so many ways. He's a better passer, certainly. He's not as good of a shooter, but he's a better passer. He's a better in pick and roll. Similar in terms of defensive profile, pros and cons. There's just so many similarities to him as a prospect, for better or for worse. And I'll talk about some of my concerns here next, and ultimately what I would do if I were the Timberwolves in this situation. We'll do all that here to close out the show. All right, Scoot Henderson as a potential Timberwolves draft pick if they were to trade Karl-Anthony Towns and acquire the number 3 pick from the Trailblazers. I've talked about what I like about him the most. And there's no question that plugging him in as a pick and roll operator sounds fantastic. Here are my concerns. Number one, the jump shot. Yes, he's a good mid-range jump shooter. The percentage isn't as good as you'd like it to be for as much as he shoots it. He shot just 22.9% in his first year in the G League from three-point range. That is horrific. Last year, he was 34.3%, which by itself is a little below league average. But the leap between 23-ish% to 34% to go, 11, improve by 11.4% in one season, that's pretty significant. Now, it's a relatively small sample size because of the number of games and minutes played in the G League. But that leap is really important for a player that went from 17 to basically 19 years old as a professional. The leap is encouraging. But if you watch him shoot from the perimeter, there doesn't seem to be a real comfort level beyond, like, I'm ballparking this, but like 18, 19 feet. Like, once you get beyond the arc, it's not the ease that Anthony Edwards had in college of, like, the percentage may not have been eye-popping, but he looked comfortable. It was an easy, 28-foot jumper, and Ant can easily shoot it from 30, 32 feet now. Like, very rarely is short on shots, gets great elevation. The shot looks good, great with pull-up jumpers with momentum. Scoot Henderson does not have that. He's not a comfortable range shooter, and you can live with that. I mean, like, you could live with it if the rest of the guys on the floor are all plus 3-point shooters. And save for Rudy Gobert, that's something the Wolves should be able to do. Jaden McDaniels was, of course, very good from 3 this year, 40%-ish. And then, of course, next year you'd have Mike Conley. I mean, I guess it gets a little dicier when you get down to some of the bench guys. We don't really know what the bench will look like. So that, to me, is a concern. I mean, the 3-point shot is not good. That's actually probably the biggest concern is you'd like to, when you're drafting somebody that high, you want the scoring touch to be good from everywhere. And it's really good everywhere inside the arc. The 23% in year 1 of the G League from 3 and 34% in year 2 is a concern. You'd like him to get the free throw line a little bit more for as much as the ball was in his hands. He effectively had a 30% usage rate last year, but only was attempting like 2.5 to 3-ish max free throws per game. That number's got to come up. He's got to absorb a little more contact, go into the body of defenders. He's got such good touch, can finish around and over people. And it's one of the things that Ant struggles with too. And so that worries me a little bit. Also defensive consistency. I think the defensive profile is really similar to Ant, where both players in college for Ant and the G League for Henderson, at times look like they're not trying defensively, which is a red flag. And I was really concerned. Go back, I mean, in 2020, I was concerned about Ant as a prospect because of the lack of try defensively. I thought that looked a lot like Andrew Wiggins, which was a concern coming out of Kansas, that Wiggins floated at times defensive on both ends of the floor. He did it at Minnesota too. I was worried about Anthony Edwards not locking in defensively. And as it turns out, that's still a concern. And like, there's a handful of games last year where Ant barely got into a defensive stance. But when he wants to, when it's a good matchup, he's one of the top defenders in the league. And I mean that. I think Ant is probably a top 10 perimeter defender league wide when he's 100% locked in. It's the consistency factor, and also the off ball attention to attention, not just attention to detail, like paying attention. That's all it is off ball. It still at times lapses there, and that was an issue for Scoot Henderson last year too. So I think a lot of the same issues. Of course, he's much shorter than Anthony Edwards, but I think he can guard pick and roll at the NBA level. I think, again, the size, the wingspan, the physicality, the athleticism, the work ethic, by all accounts, he's a strong worker, a hard worker. I don't think there's any reason Scoot Henderson can't be at the very least an average, if not a plus defensive point guard in the NBA. Fight through screens, be physical. So much of being a point of attack defender in the NBA is simply stick-to-itiveness. It's want to, it's effort of getting through and around and over screens. Something that, like, D'Angelo Russell did not have most of the time. Jordan McLaughlin has, but he doesn't have the physical tools to be as successful. And Scoot may have both. He's taller. He's obviously got much bigger wingspan than a McLaughlin. He's much more athletic than McLaughlin. He's more athletic than D'Angelo Russell. And I think he's got the want to actually fight defensively. And if that's the case, you pair him with Ant and those guys kind of keep challenging each other in the backcourt. That could be really exciting, but the consistency level has to improve. And that brings me to the roster fit. And my primary concern about the fit is usage. And I talked about this on the crossover I did with Locked On Warriors with Cyrus on Tuesday. And this is different because Jordan Poole is a different player and it's a different circumstance. But any player that's going to take the ball out of Anthony Edwards' hands that plays a similar position, guard or wing, that's not a big, concerns me. Anthony Edwards is very likely going to be a more efficient scorer than Scoot Henderson ever will be in the NBA, or certainly the next couple of years. He's going to be more efficient than Jordan Poole. And so if you're trading Karl-Anthony Towns, why would you trade for somebody? How do you justify trading for a guy who plays a very similar role, that needs the ball in his hands to be successful and is initiating offense, but also wants to call his own number a bunch and is less efficient than Anthony Edwards? You potentially could be stunting both of their growth, and the ball, is staying there. It's not getting to, Rudy gets unhappy because he's not getting the ball. And say you resign Naz Reid and he's not getting the ball as much. Like, obviously I'm telling a bit of a, I'm taking this thing a few steps down the path, but that's a concern for me. And Mike Conley is nice because he does not need the ball. He's happy to catch and shoot threes at a 38% clip or whatever, 42. No, it was like 42% clip this year. Happy to do it. He'll score every now and again. He'll make some floaters in pick and roll game. But he doesn't have to. D'Angelo Russell had to have the ball in his hands, and he wasn't a good enough passer with Rudy Gobert when the ball was in his hands, and he wasn't a good enough shooter much of the time to be efficient enough to make the Wolves offense go. So what's the happy medium? Potentially it is Scoot Henderson. Potentially he is the dynamic passer and the, ready to score when he needs to type player. But I worry a little bit about him as a rookie pairing with a still young star trying to become a superstar in a 22-year-old Anthony Edwards. What does that pairing look like? Does Scoot get frustrated because he doesn't get enough shots up? Is he mature enough to be a good enough passer to get the ball to Ant without turning it over too much? You're putting a lot of eggs in the basket of a 19-year-old rookie. Now, obviously, rookie year, he's probably not starting. It's Mike Conley, still your point guard. But you're still asking him to catch up to Ant's quote-unquote window very quickly. And I get that the timeline's closer than the Ant Cat timeline, and Scoot Henderson would be a lot cheaper than Karl-Anthony Towns from a salary perspective early on. But then you also have to, I alluded to this earlier, Scoot Henderson's Supermax is going to come up, his rookie extension would come up around the time that Ant's Supermax comes up, right? So you're going to have to make another choice. And that's kind of just the life of an NBA front office, and you kick the can as far as you can. But it's something to think about. Sitting here right now, it's a trade I would strongly consider if I were the Timberwolves. On its face, I don't like it. I would rather run it back another year, and I am of the belief, and I've said this on the show before, I think Karl-Anthony Towns is tradable in 12 months. I know he'll be making $50 million, but I think he's tradable in 12 months because I think he has a good season. He may or may not be All-NBA again. The market for him is not going to decrease. He's still going to be in his prime. If he proves he's healthy, proves he can play with play a little bit of the four, whatever. I don't think that the actual value for trading Cat will be that different than it is right now. And I am dubious about the Scoot Anthony Edwards fit. Could it work? Absolutely. And it could be dynamic. It could be dangerous. It could be really good defensively. It could be scary on offense. Could be all of those things. But I worry that they're too similar of a player, but Scoot Henderson's 3 years behind Anthony Edwards in development and 4 inches shorter than him. And not as good of a shooter like that, and not as good of a defender. The ceiling for Scoot could be very close to what Anthony Edwards' ceiling is. I buy that. But your Ant isn't even there yet, right? Anthony Edwards is not a superstar yet. So you're counting on Scoot Henderson elevating his game at a similar rate or a quicker rate than Anthony Edwards is elevating his game if you want to become a second-round playoff team or even a non-play-in playoff team. There's a lot you're relying on to fall into place. And I worry that there's just a lot that has to happen correctly, right? Now, they haven't done it with Ant and Cat together either with Rudy. But we're also talking about Rudy Gobert and Anthony Edwards, or excuse me, Karl-Anthony Towns are players who are multi-time All-NBA players already. They're already stars. So trading them for, in effect, a lottery ticket in Scoot Henderson, I get that that's on some level the name of the game, but the name of the game is acquiring stars, and the Wolves have 3 and a budding 4th in Jaden McDaniel. So I run it. If I'm the Wolves, I still run it back another year. Now, Tim Connolly is the one getting the trade offers. So if somebody, if he does, if I'm wrong about this and Towns doesn't have all that much trade value league wide, but Portland calls up and says, hey, we want Cat, we need to keep Dame happy, we'll do this. Scoot Henderson's a fine prospect. I think he's going to be a good NBA player. I think it might take him some time, a la De'Aaron Fox. There's some similarities in their games. It took De'Aaron Fox a minute to actually become a true all-star NBA, all-star caliber NBA player. I worry that's the case with Scoot Henderson and his timeline elevating to the level of Anthony Edwards. And Ant was the healthiest, best player on a team that only won 42 games this year. And I get that he was 21. Like, I get that. But if I'm the Wolves, I run it back one more year, as intended this year with Rudy and Cat. I see what happens. I revisit this thing next summer. If it comes down to it, though, Scoot Henderson, a nice prospect. I like him overall. I do think there's a tantalizing potential with him next to Anthony Edwards, but I have real questions about if they can help each other reach their respective potentials and therefore lift the Wolves to a 50-plus, win team, second round conference finals caliber team. There's some real questions about if that's a possibility. All right, that's all I have for you today here on the show. Of course, we'll be back again on Monday. We're still Monday through Friday. We'll do this all throughout, really throughout free agency. So we're going to get into some more draft stuff in June. We'll break down some other potential trade-up targets in the draft, as well as some second-round targets for the Wolves at pick number 53. We'll do all that. We'll talk about other NBA rumors. We'll talk a little finals next week. Perhaps we'll feel a little better about the finals being competitive before we record Monday's show. So all that'll be next week, Monday through Friday. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find the show. That includes, of course, YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken. That's with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.